Hello, I'm Meg King, Director of the Wilson Center's Science and Technology Innovation Program. Today's event, Global Digital Divide, Past, Present, and Future, is the brainchild of our impressive public policy fellow, Melissa Griffith, who will moderate today's event. But it's a collaboration with two other programs at the center, the Middle East and Africa programs. Thank you to Marissa Kerma and Monde Mayangwa for helping make this possible. Over the course of the next hour and a half, we'll be diving into a conversation about the changing nature of the digital divide. What once was a conversation just about internet connectivity has become much more complicated and nuanced. We'll reflect on what the United States, Africa, and Middle East have learned and discuss what to do next in order to develop and deploy policy solutions now and in the future. COVID-19 has brought this issue into even sharper focus. This year, almost overnight, we've seen a near complete shift to virtual education, employment, healthcare, etc. Connectivity and the type of connectivity, as well as digital literacy, became a critical component of public health strategies, and systemic inequalities became obvious within countries, regions, and globally. The global digital divide was alive and well. Today's discussion will illustrate this evolution, but also offer insights into next steps for those in industry, government, international organizations, and academia to make improvements now while it's front of mind. Today's event is part of a broader set of efforts here at the Wilson Center focused on the digital divide at home and abroad. The Science and Technology Innovation Program's Citizen Science and Open Hardware initiatives, and through the development of serious games, focuses on this challenge. And the Middle East program has two initiatives, two of particular note, the MENA Workforce Development Initiative and the Middle East Women's Initiative. Both focus on an important and often overlooked component of the digital divide in the Middle East, digital literacy and workforce development. We hope you'll engage with these diverse sets of initiatives across the Wilson Center going forward. The conversation cannot and should not stop here today. And on that note, it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator and panelists. Dr. Melissa Griffith, Science and Technology Innovation Program Public Policy Fellow, works at the intersection of emerging technology and national security. Her current research focuses on topics such as 5G and how states organize cyber defense. She's also a non-resident research fellow at the University of California, Berkeley's Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity, and an adjunct assistant professor at Georgetown Center for Security Studies. Dr. Steve Weber is the Associate Dean and Head of School at the UC Berkeley School of Information and the Faculty Director of the Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity. He works at the intersection of technology markets, intellectual property regimes, and international politics. His research, teaching, and advisory work focus on the political economy of knowledge-intensive industries with special attention to healthcare information technology, software, and global political economy issues relating to competitiveness. Dr. Sukaina Al-Nasraoui is in Beirut, joining us late at night, and a social affairs expert leading sustainable urban development portfolio at the UN Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia. She has in-depth expertise in technology for sustainable development, statistical analysis, gender sensitization, and women's socioeconomic empowerment. Her research is focused on regional studies on various development issues, including prospects of information and communication technologies for achieving gender equality and the impact of the Fourth Industrial Revolution on development, including gender equality. Zenya Kebede is an electrical engineer and certified wireless network specialist, currently working as a technical program manager in Microsoft Airband Initiative team, supporting both US and international teams with technical design and implementation of the Airband engineering projects. Kebede also has more than 10 years of experience in telecommunications, and we should talk to you about 5G later. I'm sure you have lots to say. Melissa, over to you.
Thank you, Meg, and thank you to everyone who's joining us in the audience and to all of our excellent panelists that are here with us today. So I'm going to offer a few sort of scoping framing remarks before we dive into the meat of this panel. So as Meg mentioned, COVID-19 has placed concerns over the digital divide in stark relief. But, and I think it is important to note, the digital divide, both locally in the United States and globally, was alive and well far before this pandemic. So I think it's important to think about the evolution of the digital divide, not just in the scope of a pandemic, but more broadly throughout periods of history. So today we're going to discuss the nature of that divide in a global context. So not just US focused, but far more broadly. We're going to answer questions like, what do we mean by digital divide? How have our understandings of this problem we faced evolved over time? What solutions should we be investing in now to best equip us for the future? What you'll find over the course of this panel is there is no single digital divide. We are honestly talking about, in the next hour and a half, digital divides, plural. These divides span questions of connectivity around the world through wired, wireless, and satellite connections, and focus on how certain communities, countries, continents, and regions have faced sharp inequalities due to a lack of connectivity or quality of connectivity. The global digital divide can also be found in emerging technologies. How we develop and deploy machine learning and quantum computing, for example, will also impact the digital divides we face in the future. And finally, the global digital divide can be found not just in access to digital tools and networked infrastructure, but in the training and literacy necessary to leverage and take full advantage of those digital tools. This raises questions of workforce development and gender inequities. Each of these topics are part of a broader global digital divide. They have their own unique causes, areas of concern, and importantly, they require their own sets of solutions. So while 5G networks, for example, may offer utility in addressing some aspects of, say, rural-urban or even urban-urban divides within cities by providing connectivity where connectivity was sparse, it holds less promise for solving other types of divides. And while emerging technologies hold significant economic and security promise, they can also entrench existing inequities or introduce new ones into our conversation. With that breadth in mind, we hope you leave today with a better understanding of how the global digital divide has evolved, what each of us can do from our vantages as policymakers, scholars, and industry leaders to make our future more equitable than our past. So without further ado, let us turn to our three panelists who are very fortunate to have with us today. We'll begin with about 7 to 10 minutes from each of them that will serve as opening remarks. They will speak to what the digital divide means to them, how they have understood how it has evolved, and where they sit in the broader global digital divide conversation. From this foundation, we will enter into a moderated discussion that will delve into persisting challenges, common misconceptions, and potential policy, potential policy solutions. After that moderated discussion, we'll transition to what we hope will be a vibrant Q&A with our audience. So throughout this panel, please send us your questions at STIP, that's STIP, at wilsoncenter.org. You can also tweet them to us at WilsonSTIP with the hashtag Digital Divide. You're also welcome to follow along with us today on the Twitter accounts of all three programs at the Wilson Center that are participating, but please remember to send your questions to STIP so that we can include them in this ongoing discussion. Okay, so let us go ahead and follow in the order of the program. Steve, would you please kick us off?
Great, thanks, Melissa. And thanks to everybody for organizing this panel. You know, it's particularly timely here in the United States where we're at the moment so obsessed, and maybe appropriately, with election security and competition policy, to take a little bit of a step back and ask ourselves, what is the digital divide issue going to look like going forward? And how can we not be so reactive to it all the time? I want to kind of hit Melissa's point again. We're living through a period of great, fantastic new technology that's creating enormous wealth. But the history of technology is that when you get these technology revolutions, at least in their first iterations, they often exacerbate rather than decrease inequality. And they're generally counterproductive for global liberalism as well. So if you think about railroads in the 1800s, powering growth of the US and many, of course, many other economies, it was really great if you were living in the nodes where the railroad trunks came together, but it wasn't so great if you were living in small towns off those nodes where economies and societies were devastated. And you can note the same kinds of consequences, of course, of container shipping. It was really good if you were living in the port of Los Angeles or the port of Rotterdam, but if you were in a place where you had to do multimodal transport, it was obviously much more expensive to be on the grid, as it were. And so I want to sort of talk about how that dynamic is going to look going forward, which with what I think is the next real important and crucial technology that is emerging that sort of follows in that kind of progression of railroads, container shipping, and what next in terms of reducing boundaries and barriers to global economic exchange of goods, services, and ideas. Because that's where I think the next digital divide is going to hit us. And I think we can do some things to prevent it from being as bad as it would otherwise happen to be on its own. So what's that next frontier? How do we do better? What I'm working on, my research, my argument is located in the software layer, and particularly a tool that many of us use on a frequent basis, which is best represented by Google Translate and other such tools, and it's called machine translation. So what's the big deal about machine translation, and what can we do to amplify the upside? I want to make 3 key points about this. Everybody knows the myth of the Tower of Babel from the Bible. Before the tower, supposedly humans all spoke one language, and they were able to coordinate their economic activities so efficiently that they could build a stairway to heaven. And I'm just thinking of the Led Zeppelin version of that, but that Tower of Babel was supposed to reach heaven. God decides that that's a bad idea and introduces a diversity of languages into human civilization, really for the purpose of creating transaction costs and economic friction between people who would otherwise be able to work together. We see that now as having had many positive upside effects: a diversity of thought, a diversity of practice, to some extent culture. But of course, it also makes economic coordination much more difficult. So I have a forthcoming paper where I'm trying to sort of show a couple of different methods to try to estimate the extent to which language barriers have now emerged as one of the last big roadblocks to global coordination of economic exchange. And I think it's just really simple to think about it this way. It used to be really expensive to move physical goods around the world, so we invented and deployed container shipping. Then I'm old enough to remember where it was expensive to move ideas around the world and services through something called long distance phone calls, which were quite expensive. And so to remove that barrier, we developed and deployed the internet. So what barriers now remain? And my answer, with the best evidence that I can muster from some natural experiments, is language. So in colloquial terms, you can standardize parts for the auto industry and ship them around the world. But it's much harder to do that with complex ideas and tacit knowledge, even when you and I do speak the same language. And if you and I speak really different languages, and we have to use slow and expensive and often inaccurate human translators, we've all experienced this at one time or another, it's extremely clunky. That's a transaction cost that limits economic exchange and exchange of ideas. So how do we lower that barrier? Well, the answer in theory is, of course, machine translation. And we all have experienced the magic of Google Translate, similar products. As I said, it calls to mind, depending on your age, Babel fish or the Star Trek Universal Translator. Except when you look under the hood, the technology that drives machine translation isn't universal. And how it works really matters, because what we think of as machine translation today is not universal, and it's not going to become that anytime soon. So I want to take just the tiniest diversion into the technology for a moment. Most current or contemporary machine learning systems are supervised machine learning that use training data sets labeled by human beings. In other words, existing translations. Probably nobody would be surprised to find out that the Bible is the most commonly translated book into the most languages in the world. People who work in and around the European Union know that all European Union documents are translated into all the member state languages. So essentially you have this wonderful training data set for languages. These are referred to as high resource languages, which are commonly used and translated into each other. And as a result, the algorithms that are trained on those training data sets are really, really good. On the other hand, if you're thinking about translating from, say, Swahili to Urdu, or any example of 2 lower resource languages where there isn't good training data, those algorithms are really not very good. And the difference between the very best machine translation between high resource languages and the very worst machine translation between low resource language is roughly 5 orders of magnitude. So there's your gradient of transaction costs all over again. And yeah, there are ways to go around that. You can translate through English, but that's computationally intensive and it introduces compounding errors at each step. There are some more advanced technologies called neural machine translation, which are trying to create something more like the Star Trek Universal Translator. They don't work very well. So right now, what we're creating is a flat world, as it were, for high resource languages, and a much more barrier-driven world for low resource languages. And if you think of that as the kind of next great generation of globalization technology, it's very easy to see immediately what would happen. A new digital divide based on language compatibility. A global network of economic production and ideas distribution that would concentrate in nodes of high resource language usage and migrate away from low resource language areas. And in many cases, that's going to map on to existing areas of privilege and less privilege, and left to itself, if the technology by itself drives that deployment, it's going to get worse, not better. Now, there's a lot of interesting kind of human elements that will emerge over the next decade as machine technology becomes more prevalent. If we want to, we can discuss them. Some of them are super interesting. You know, if you think about comprehension and false positives, even when we speak the same language, it's very easy for us to misunderstand each other. When we're working through translation, we're going to assume most likely that we understand more of what that other person is saying than they actually do, because we all know that idioms and metaphors differ between language sets and so on and so forth. Lots of other ideas that we can talk about what else that means. You can ponder really fascinating consequences. It just turns out that, for example, people who speak different languages don't frequently get married to each other. So 10 years from now, we could easily see that change, which might be a good thing for the hybridization of the human race and cultures and so on and so forth. But I want to end by just noting, we can talk more about solutions as we go. But the downside effects of machine translation on the software layer of the digital divide could be really, really significant because of the affordances of the technology. There are ways to fix it, and I hope we will talk about it, but left on its own as a simple technology, engineering, and deployment matter, it will get worse, not better. Let me end with that.
Thank you, Steve. I think you do a really good job in pushing us from thinking just about digital divides in terms of the infrastructure and connectivity, specifically to the software layer, and then more broadly to be thinking about the types of design and development decisions we make now and how those may lead to kind of entrenching or creating new forms of digital divides in the future. Sukaina, would you please sort of transition us more to a discussion toward workforce and skilled practice, a different aspect of the digital divide?
Yes, of course. Thank you, Melissa, for giving me the floor. And thank you, Stephen, for a very interesting technical talk. But please first allow me to thank the Wilson Center for organizing such a timely panel on a very interesting topic, which, as you said, Melissa, should not just be discussed in the scope of a pandemic, but rather at a wider scope. So I'll take the discussion from the technical perspective to the socio-economic development and sustainable development perspective, and bring in the perspective of the Arab region since to wider the scope of the digital divide. So as we all know, over the past few decades, digital technologies have dramatically transformed the societies and the economies around the world, and of course the Arab region included. And today they've become an essential part of our modern culture, and they cover almost all aspects of our life. But in the Arab region, I mean, there are so many developing countries, and we note a variance across between developed countries and developing countries. And we note a variance between the regions of the world in terms of benefiting from the added values of these technologies, which basically create what we call the digital divide in the Arab region, which definitely we should address if we're aspiring to achieve sustainable development. Now, if we look into numbers in our region, we notice, unfortunately, that almost every single indicator shows that there is a significant difference between developed and developing countries in terms of accessing and using digital technologies. If we take it a step further and look at the the information communication technology development, we noticed that which is an index that is developed by the International Telecommunication Union, we noticed that there is an improvement around the world, the Arab region included, but unfortunately it is still below the world average. And this applies not only on the general status of the technological development per se, but also on the subcomponents of this development, whether we look at the access subcomponent, or we look at the use subcomponent, or we look at the skill subcomponent, we notice that the averages in the Arab region are all below the world average, of course, at the exception of the mobile subscriptions. That is not, and this is also is not uniform across the region itself. We notice a great variance across the regions, and within the Arab region, there is a huge variance between the countries. Like we notice most, let's say half of the Arab countries in terms of development of digital infrastructure is below the world average. So, which takes us to think of the digital divide in our region, in the Arab region, or more widely in the Middle East and North Africa region, as a problem that has a geographic, demographic, and socioeconomic dimension. Okay, and not only this, it basically has also different types. I mean, it is a divide at the local level, at the national, at the regional level, and also it has different aspects. It has the gender divide, it has the age divide, it has the income divide. And since the digital gender divide is of high importance to the region, I would like to focus on it in this topic, and I would like to bring in the discussion on the importance of gender equality in the diaspora of digitization, and and add this layer to the digital divide. But before going into like giving you the status quo of the gender digital divide, I want to share with you the fact that the global gender gap currently reaches around 31% globally. And when compared to the MENA region, the MENA region is the region that has the highest, unfortunately, that has the highest gender gap. And if development keeps the same pace, we will need in this region more than 140 years to basically bridge this gap, which is alarming. And the main areas where we have to focus is economic participation and political participation, so that we bridge this gap. And I'm bringing this because digital technologies offer key opportunities to enhance the performance of people. And when we talk about gender and ICTs, gender and digital technologies, we are not talking basically about something new. It's something that has roots that dates back to the Beijing Platform for Action, and that was focused on in the World Summit of the Information Society, and it was reiterated 10 years afterwards. And recently in the Global Development Agenda, which is the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, I bet we all heard about it. We have the Sustainable Development Goals that considered those technologies, those digital technologies, as means of implementation for gender equality. Thus, the need to focus on bridging the digital gender gap. Now, if I want to emerge a little bit more into the status of the digital gender gap in the region, in terms of mobile ownership, the gap reaches 9%, which is above the world average. And if we were to consider not only mobile ownership, but rather mobile internet access, this gap jumps from 9% to 21%. And in both cases, it is still above the world average. So in both cases, we're above the world average, and on top of it, we have a wider gap between mobile ownership and mobile internet access. And this is important to note because most of the estimations show that the majority of the population, more than 90% of the world population, will be covered by mobile broadband networks. So imagine how many women are losing opportunities because of not being connected. The same applies to the internet penetration, not necessarily from the mobile perspective. There is a gap that amounts to around 17%. There is improvement. We cannot ignore that there is improvement. However, the gap is still there. And if we want to if we want to really achieve gender equality and women empowerment, we have to bridge this gap. Now, what are we losing if, in terms of development and in terms of achieving sustainable development, what are we losing on if we do not bridge this gap? I mean, we at the Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia have been doing lots of normative work in that regard. And we dissected the different issues that apply globally, but also that are beneficial to the region. And we basically reached the conclusion that using digital technologies can help the region and all countries in the region in combating gender-based discrimination, either through challenging gender norms and stereotypes, or basically influencing household decisions in others. It can combat violence against women, which is one of the issues that are considered as pandemics in the region. It can enhance security of women and girls. It can help in identifying, reporting, and confronting norms leading to violence. It can help in campaigning and raising women's voices. Using digital technologies can also enhance economic participation of women through engaging them in income generating activities and entrepreneurial activities, which are crucial by enhancing their access to financial resources, their access to information, and many other. It can also enhance their access to public life and their participation in public life, added to universal access and sexual and reproductive health, which are all issues that are bundled under the Goal 5 on gender equality within the SDGs that are part of the Agenda 2030. So I don't want to take more than the time given to us, but just to end this discussion, which can take hours and hours if we want to dwell on it, I'd like to say that from the development perspective, digital technologies offer key opportunities that can steer the wheel of women's empowerment. Of course, when we talk about women empowerment, we're talking about a process of change that is multidimensional and context specific. And closing this digital gender gap would seriously be like a magic wand for the Arab region to foster sustainable development, especially that we're living in the fourth industrial revolution. I'll end with this point, and I'm definitely ready to answer any question in that regard. Thank you, Melissa. Over to you.
Thank you so much. I think what you did for us there was highlight both the kind of state of play in the MENA region, the Middle East and Northern Africa, but then also really hone in on the stakes around a global digital divide and the implications of allowing that divide to persist. So really giving us a sense of what's at stake in this conversation in a very tangible way. So thank you for that. We're now going to transition to Zaina, who is going to give us a sort of private sector view on some of the critical infrastructure components of the digital divide.
Thank you, Melissa. And I would like to say, first of all, I want to thank you, the Wilson Center, and to provide such a very interesting and timely topic for discussion. I wanted to thank my fellow panelists and also our moderator, Melissa and Meg. I work in a Microsoft team called the Microsoft Urban Initiative Team. And I would like to give you a little bit of highlight, how we see digital divide from our perspective and how we actually get involved in this initiative in bridging the digital divide. 4 decades ago, of course, Microsoft had this radical and ambitious plan. As you know, Microsoft is a company built on democratizing and providing access for people. So 4 decades ago, the notion was, how could we have a computer in every household, in every desk? At the time, it seems an ambitious plan, but looking it back now, we can see that we all have devices that we interact every day in our houses. Now, a very important point, and I think a major problem that we see our global view is that, as a cloud services company, as our productivity tools company, there is a significant challenge when half of the world population do not have access to internet. And when in some parts of the world, specifically in Africa and also the rest of the world, the connectivity problem is highly interrelated with energy access problem. So our mission in Microsoft is to empower every person and organization to achieve more. Now, how could you empower people and organizations to achieve more when half of the world population do not have access to reliable internet access? As part of that, our program was launched about 3.5 years ago in July 2017 by our company president and chief legal officer. Primarily, the goal of the program was how do we bridge this digital divide, and our significant role will be to connect the unconnected. And our outlook is basically in this ecosystem, how do we partner with different stakeholders, which includes service providers, government, and also others, to drive the cost of access so that people can have and take advantage of the productivity tools and services that we do best. We don't aspire to be telcos. We don't aspire to be a car manufacturing company. We would like to partner with this kind of organizations to enhance their reach and their footprint. So basically, we are almost halfway through our initiative. In fact, our name before we launched the Urban Initiative was somehow self-explanatory. It was called Affordable Access Initiative. Innovation for the sake of innovation and access for the sake of access is not going to change anything unless otherwise it's affordable and it's accessible by all members of the society. Today, many of us enjoy high-speed internet from the living rooms of our couch and when ordering food, connecting to the services that we want online. But for many people, this is not the reality. So as part of that, we make two important public commitments in participating in this digital divide. The first was focused in US. Even though in US there is a lot of implementations to bridge the gap, but we still have about 18 million people in the United States who does not have access to reliable broadband. And this is according to the Federal Communications Report. So we make a public commitment to bring connectivity to 3 million Americans who are living in rural areas. The second part of our public commitment was to bring connectivity to 40 million people who are living outside of US. Now, our model is absolutely, it's always going to be a partnership. As I said, there's no way that there's no single silver bullet to solve the digital divide problem. So there has to be a way which we have to follow an innovative approach to partner with our different stakeholders and also service providers to drive the cost of hardware, to bring all the parties on the table to solve this problem. So as part of that, in halfway through our program, we are actually having currently a commercial project in 28 plus states in US. These are purely commercial projects because our ecosystem ranges from providing technology specialists on cloud solution architect, on RF engineering, on network design and innovative approach of network, on Azure and other services, up to directly investing on these technologies where our partners can expand their portfolio and ecosystem and footprint to reach the last mile and the unconnected people. So in US, we have commercial projects that we partner with service providers in 28 states, but also in a globally outside of US, we have projects in 25 plus countries. And with this effort on halfway of our project, we have brought connectivity to up to 16 million people living outside of US and 4 million people living in US at the moment. Now, I think the core idea here is that the connectivity challenge is going to continue unless otherwise we're doing something about it. So our goal is simply to take a strategy which technologies can help to bring that affordable access to the people who are going to be connected. And when you look at the telecommunication toolkit, what we follow is a tool in a toolkit approach. There are different technologies, including mobile communications, people are deploying and different stakeholders are putting a lot of investment on different technologies to bridge the divide. But our approach is, we know that technologies like fiber, for example, is a golden standard. It is good, it's reliable, but the challenge is the economics does not work. So it takes time, and fiber was not going to get us there. So it's not a way to close the digital divide, or it's not a approach to get the digital divide the soonest. So we take a strategy to invest on wireless technologies, which are in unlicensed basis, which helps to reduce the cost of the device, and leverage all other technologies such as fixed wireless, millimeter wave, TV white spaces, CBRS, and others. So we follow a multi-technology, multi-frequency approach to drive the cost of access and also to help partners reach those areas which they are not able to reach. But undeniably, what we have noticed is there are two major problems regardless of the technology. One is there needs to be worldwide a clear and a stable regulatory environment in order to bridge this digital divide. And the second piece is that all innovation and technology that we do to bridge the digital divide need to be affordable and accessible for people to use them, so that they could think that whatever amount of payments that they're making for the service that they are getting should be justifiable. So as part of our initiative, we're going to continue to work with different stakeholders to bridge this digital divide, because it's incumbent upon us and also other stakeholders to do this, because as a business in Microsoft, the way we see it is we are a cloud services company. Without internet access, there is no cloud. So we have almost 2 more years left to our initiative, but also we are aggressively working to bridge and bring that connectivity to the last mile for people to have that digital transformation that we all look into. I think in closing, what I would like to say is, one of the learning that we have learned going all over the world is every country have a different type of policy and context. So we need to be able to have that partnership which makes sense to the partners in order to solve this barrier and close this digital divide. I'll just pause there and maybe also follow up with some questions later.
Thank you so much. I think between the 3 speakers, what you have seen illustrated today is sort of 3 different pleas around the digital divide, right? One is, please don't forget the software. Another is, please don't forget the gender divide. And then this connectivity challenge that we sort of ended on. As a quick reminder, before I sort of start the moderated discussion component of this and punt some questions at our 3 panelists, for those of you that are frantically trying to figure out ways to submit questions of your own for the final Q&A piece, you can do that by email, by emailing STIP, that's stip@wilsoncenter.org. Or if you like your Twitter platform, you may also tweet us, that's WilsonStip, use the hashtag digital divide. So please be having those questions come in now, and we will pivot to those in the sort of final components, final few minutes, 30 minutes, not very few, 30 minutes of our panel today. So I want to press each of you. There's been a lot of discussion, obviously, in the United States, but also abroad around the pandemic. And specifically that the pandemic has put significant pressure, given sort of public health incentives, to go virtual and to go virtual almost overnight, right? To really have to be able to rely on a lot of the things that you are talking about at scale, both for education, the workforce, and just access to services like healthcare, all happening at once. I know we have a variety of expertise in the room, both in terms of regions and sort of continents, the Middle East and Africa, and also in terms of the technology at play. Could each of you sort of speak to the existing problems that COVID-19 has really put into sharp relief for us around digital divides? But then also on a more positive note, have there been some kind of clever opportunities or solutions that have come out of COVID-19 in terms of addressing some of those problems? We're just going to stick to the kind of program order for simplicity's sake. So Steve, would you please kick us off?
Let's try that again. I'm gonna make 2 really quick observations on that. I think it's a really great question. I feel like, well, I guess now it's 10 months, but at the beginning of the pandemic, I used to say to my friends and colleagues, we've had 10 years of digital transformation in 10 weeks. Now I suppose it's 10 months. And I think predictably that has led to some really interesting insights about where the rate limiting factors really are. So I'm just going to talk parochially about what I see here in the Bay Area. We have decent internet connectivity, ironically, in the Bay Area, and not fantastic. But what we don't have, and particularly at a university like Berkeley, are the human elements of the ability to quickly adapt to do things online that we used to do in physical space. It's sort of weird, maybe conceptually a little tricky to think about that as a digital divide. But maybe we should, in the sense that even where the infrastructure, the software layer are pretty well kind of functioning, people take a long time to understand what it means to transfer activities from the physical layer into the digital world. I feel like telemedicine has made that transition really pretty quickly, and you sort of look at that and wonder why it took so long, and thank goodness that actually we have this acceleration. But in higher education, it's been almost exactly the opposite. Many of my colleagues had never imagined that they would be teaching online. What they did was essentially take their existing way of doing things and did it in front of a Zoom camera. It doesn't work terribly well. It would have been better, in fact, it works terribly. It would have been better if we had had a little more time to help ease that transition. And I think for me, like the lesson coming out of that is you probably don't know where the kind of like operational digital divide that prevents people from making full use of that transformation is actually going to show up. I think what Zaina said about the energy correlate, like the lack of, if you don't have reliable energy, it's kind of hard to have a reliable internet connection. Those are sort of like the baseline problems that everybody's going to experience we have to solve, so that we can, in a weird way, discover what the other ones are as people try to build systems, services, and frankly, their lives in that digital layer.
Thank you. Sukaina, can you talk to us a little bit about kind of your expertise out of the Middle East, what COVID-19 has laid bare, and then maybe some potential positive lights at the end of these tunnels?
Yes, absolutely. And I'll start by saying I cannot agree more with Stephen, because I mean, when he talked about the baseline and establishing the baseline of things that needs to be changed, this applies also to the Arab region, and I think it applies to the different regions of the world. There are so many issues that relate to digital literacy, others that relate to online education, etc., that governments were not really convinced of. But with this pandemic and the virtual shift, everything changed. But if you allow me, because I mean, I started the talk from the perspective of development, I'll bring in the issue to development in general, and also how it affected women, Arab women in specific. Now, to start with COVID-19, since you asked about the region, hit the region drastically, and estimations and statistics show that it led to losses in real GDP that amounted to around $152 billion. It led to a loss in jobs, to around 17 million jobs in the region. It pushed more than 14 million people into poverty and others. Now, in terms of the digital gap between, let's say, the technological haves and have-nots, it widened even more during the COVID-19 pandemic in a number of striking ways, I have to say. And had profound effects on Arab women in specific. Like, for example, if you allow me, like simply if we think of having less income, less education, and less infrastructure, that meant less access to technology, which in turn meant less access to necessary health information, which was really crucial in this period. As for education shifts to mostly online platforms, the infrastructure in most of the countries in the region was not very ready for that. But the positive note is that the element of digital literacy became very, very clear. And digital literacy clearly privileged some people over others. And that issue became on the top of the agendas, development agendas of countries in the region. Another point that I'd like to highlight from the development perspective is that education as being the door to employment also means that many Arab women, by being left out from the increasingly online-based education, since, as I told you, I mean, there are issues in the digital literacy, this means that they will be more likely left out from the realm of formal employment as well. And I wanted to mention this point because already the Arab region suffers from a high rate of unpaid care work, and women are mostly employed in the informal sector. So by this pandemic basically noted the importance of building the digital literacy and bridging the gender digital divide so that also we avoid this employment issue. And the modality of work from home also, the shift towards the virtual environment means that the modality of work is only limited or restricted to the technologically savvy and economically privileged professionals, which also highlighted another development element that should be deeply considered. So this is in general the general picture of COVID-19 development and women empowerment. But if you allow me, I'd like to say that it was an opportunity, and it is an opportunity for change, for positive change, because this pandemic basically is leading to a radical re-envisioning of structures of labor, resources, and security, which will necessarily be part of a post-COVID-19 reality in the Arab region. And this presents a chance. So that's the positive realm, actually. This presents a chance to change the prevailing gender norms in the region, as well as to draw closer attention to the ways in which women's labor is a vital part of Arab economies. And I'll end at this point. Thank you, Melissa.
Thank you. Zaina, so I know that you bring to this conversation a vibrant background in sort of the understanding of the state of play in Africa. So if you could speak a little bit about the state of play in Africa and the ways that perhaps coronavirus has really laid bare some of these digital divides. And then the same sort of plea as I gave the first two panelists, is there any sort of optimism, room for hope, light at the end of the tunnel that coronavirus has really provided for us?
Sure, Melissa. Thank you so much. I think I have to say both of my fellow panelists have really very well summarized. In fact, some of the things that my talking points, I would say. I think one of the things that we all have learned significantly is that the economic and the social ramifications of COVID-19 has shown that it significantly impacts those who do not have access to high-speed, reliable internet, and otherwise what we call as the broadband gap, right? Mm-hmm. But also, if you think about it, even in the best of times, these areas are places where people living in these areas do not have access to services, which we call in modern life services, such as e-learning or remote learning or telemedicine or other services, which can be used to kind of change the economic impacts in the society. So at the beginning, before even the pandemic hit, some areas already have been lagging behind in adoption of technology. But also this crisis presents a significant need for those who are working on broadband gap and bridging the digital divide to move quickly, advance infrastructure and also tools and services to connect as many people as users. And I think I agree with Steve that he said we have 10 years of digital transformation within 10 weeks at the beginning, because we don't know how long this thing was going to last. But if anything, when you look at Africa, many African countries face significant challenges at their becoming as a global competitor. But the impact of COVID-19 have shown that the African countries' development can either be really massive barrier to development, or it should also spark lights of fire to use this as an important learning curve for innovation, investment, change, and policy, and also reform policies. But also in a global scale, I think one thing what we learned is that there is no denying fact that most of the areas which are hit by COVID-19 and the digital adoption has been all at the beginning even worse. And even to summarize, but also in a regional basis, what is very important is that we have learned that it is now a necessity rather than a luxury to have a technology policy to fast track adoption of technologies. In Africa, if you take a simplest context, for example, increasing, this is an ITU data, if you increase the adoption of broadband by 10%, basically that will be translated as an increase in GDP by 2.5%. So, I mean, following or taking the learnings that we have from COVID-19, if we fast track adoption of technologies, that will definitely help to increase the economic advancements that the countries are having. But also in a global scale, I think we have a significant digital transformation, but also a learning curve for many who are working on infrastructure, One, we need to upgrade our legacy infrastructure, because the type of speeds that we are getting in our home, they are not enough when they are shared or when there is oversubscription in these systems. But also at the same time, we need to connect those areas who do not have access today to participate in this digital economy. And on top of that, we need to use technology to understand the pandemic itself and also address the issue that's coming from the pandemic.
Thank you. Before we transition to a broader Q&A, which I'm sure will be quite vibrant given the number of questions that are already coming in, I would like to shift our panelists' focus towards solutions. Right? I think we've done a good job kind of laying out what the problems are that we face. So let's start talking about some possible ways to solve this. And we often, when we reach for solutions, talk about the responsibility or the opportunity for government or international organizations to play a role in addressing digital divides. I'd actually like us to get to that question second, and instead start with a question about the private sector. Right? What is the opportunity and also the responsibility of the private sector in this space to address various aspects of the digital divide you have already touched on? And given that, Zaina, you actually hit on some of these things in your opening remarks, I am going to flip the order of responses, start with Zaina and then work our way back to Steve. So if you could please kick us off.
Sure. Thank you so much, Melissa. I think there are, some point that I would like to highlight, especially, how should we as a private sector and also participate in helping this digital divide? One of the things that I would say is that specifically from technological point of view in addressing a digital divide, we need to be very innovative. Technology is always advancing beyond our expectation in a significant pace. So we need to have a significant innovation that need to happen in the policy arena and also in the business arena. And specifically from private sector point of view, we need to continue research on innovative technologies. When I say innovative technologies, including how we use spectrum as is. For example, the models that we follow today, spectrum is a finite resource. Spectrum is, the mindset in many areas is spectrum is scarce, and it's a finite resource, obviously, but it's scarce and it's not enough for others. But we need to have a shift in mindset. Instead of having that mindset to use spectrum as a scarce resource, we need to think of spectrum as a dynamic resource and as a tool that we can use spectrum to have ubiquitous services. To give you an example, for example, one of the things when we begin the initiative in Microsoft is we use a technology called TV white spaces. And this is a technology that we have been researching for more than a decade in Microsoft. Today, if you are watching TV in channel 3 and channel 4, how could we bring a broadband signal to your house using the unused channel? Maybe it's channel 5. And this is basically leveraging what is existing there, but also using it innovatively to bridge the digital divide. By nature, these TV broadcasting signals have ability to go longer distances, but we have researched it and worked with many in the ecosystem to bring a technology called TV white space in the market today so that it could solve this significant problem. And one of the things is, mature radio technology, which uses innovative spectrum because it uses what is called a dynamic spectrum access. This is not something which is allocated for one vendor. There are incumbent broadcasters using it, but those frequencies that are not used by broadcasters as a secondary basis, we can use them innovatively because they are sitting there without doing nothing. So the private sector needs to continue to innovate in areas like spectrum innovation. And the other important point is also we need to continue our research to have ubiquitous and affordable access technologies. This should not be limited to one technology or another, but also we have to look the whole portfolio. So the private sector needs to continue working on that. And I might add some more points on the policy side, but I will just hold on to later.
Perfect. Yes, hold the policy because we will get to that one next on the policymakers and international organizations. But Sukaina, talk to us a little bit about the roles and responsibilities of the private sector in addressing the digital divide.
Yes, definitely, Melissa. First of all, I'd like to highlight the fact that the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development basically had the Sustainable Development Goals, and Goal 17 focuses on the importance of partnerships and the importance of stakeholders' engagement to achieve sustainable development, the private sector included. And that is core because this has gained the attention of all governments and the buy-in and the sort. So having said this, the private sector plays an important role in, I would say, bridging the digital divide and bridging the gender digital divide, but not on its own, rather from the development perspective, rather hands in hands with governments and with the civil society, which in many cases in the Arab region at least, and up to my knowledge in most of the regions of the world, play an important role in enhancing the digital literacy and equal digital literacy. So what role can they play? I would say we need to focus on, as Zina said, on increasing affordability, because one of the main internet adoption barriers in developing countries and in our region is affordability. A large group of people cannot really access the internet because of the high costs involved. Cost of smartphones, laptops, computers are expensive despite like technology being a basic need. So that is one front that the private sector can really play a crucial role in. There is a need for empowering the users, and when we talk about empowering users, we're talking about building the capacities and the capabilities to see the full potential of digital technologies and their impact. We must take advantage of the capabilities of these digital technologies and empower people equally to use them. And of course, the private sector can play a big role in that. Now, there is a need to increase, I would say, the relevance of online content. And we know, I mean, the private sector contributes a lot in the production of the content on the net. And in our region, there is a problem, and this also links to the language barrier that Steve also talked about. There is the Arabic, the digital Arabic content is scarce, and the private sector can play an important role in the provision of such a content, either through the automatic translation or through the development of the content in Arabic per se. One final comment that may be particular to the region is in relation to the entrepreneurial activities. I'd like to mention that globally, investments, private sector investment goes more to, I mean, there is a huge difference between the fund investments that the private sector makes in startups that are founded and headed by men compared to those founded or headed by women. And when it comes to revenues, we know there is a difference between the revenues of startups being led by men and women to the advantage of women. In the region, 1 out of 3 startups are being either founded or led by women. And the private sector support in basically having at least equal funding opportunities would have a major impact on achieving or at least on diminishing the gender gap. I'll end in here. Of course, I mean, we can talk a lot more about it, but let's jump to Steve.
We're definitely covering a lot of territory in very limited time, so I thank you for doing that. I know it's a challenge. Steve, from your vantage, what are the roles and responsibilities of the private sector in this space?
Yeah, I don't know that I have that much to add to the really good points that Sakane and Zaina made. I'll just maybe underscore or double click on a couple of them. I think firms are really good at developing technology, and they're really good at innovating in business models. And so I think that's where they should spend their greatest attention. I think Zaina's point about spectrum innovation, software-defined radio, all the kinds of things that can be done to kind of make the problem technologically easier are obviously best done in the context of the private sector. I would just add one little thought that I think might be a bit controversial, but I'm going to say it anyway, because boy, you know, we're paying a lot of attention again here in the United States these days to the downsides of oligopolistic concentration in the technology industry, at least among the big firms. And oligopolies have upsides too, which is that if Microsoft, Google, Facebook, and Amazon got together and decided that they were going to use some of that oligopolistic concentration to essentially co-invest in the foundation of access it would be a pre-competitive, well, legally would it be pre-competitive? I don't know. But from a market perspective, it would be a pre-competitive collective good that would benefit all the firms and benefit the world as well. And so the only disagreement that I have with Zaina on that, why should Microsoft be doing this alone? Why not in collaboration with the other firm? And when I say this, probably one of the most important elements of that collaboration would be to avoid the mistake, both actually in reality and perceptually, that Facebook made in India with Facebook Basics, which was one firm's, of course, effort to provide a very limited form of internet access, essentially for free, but not real internet, not access to the entire free and open internet the way in which we would want to see it. So I'd like to see the firms get together a little bit on this. Think of it as foundational infrastructure for the internet economy, and build together.
Excellent. Thank you, Steve, for introducing a little bit of controversy to our panel. It's always good to have a little of that. We have a good number of questions pouring in, so I want to get to those as soon as possible, but I want to give each of our speakers a chance to talk to the flip side of this coin. We've talked about private sector. Let's talk about government and international organizations. And here I'm going to actually start with Sukaina, then we'll go to Zaina, and then end with Steve. So please start us off with a discussion about kind of the roles and responsibilities when we think about governments and international organizations.
Okay, so again, I cannot stress more that in the diaspora of sustainable development and the global development agenda, we have to engagement, stakeholder engagement is core. And when we talk about stakeholders engagement, we're talking about the governments, we're talking about international entities, we're talking about the private sector, we're talking about the civil society. And as Steve mentioned, we're talking about partnerships among the entities and among the entities from one group and between entities from different groups. Now, of course, if I want to focus more on governments, it's important to talk about their commitments to the global development agenda. And since I started talking about gender and technology, I mean, excuse me, but this is a very dear topic to my heart, and I keep on talking about it because it needs to be always present at the among the priorities, development priorities. So in terms of governments, I mean, we need commitments to the international frameworks, and they're already there. Like in terms of gender equality, most of the countries in the region, they have commitment. They are signatories of the Beijing Platform for Action, which promotes gender equality and which also focuses on the full and equal participation of women through media and communication tools. Again, the World Summit on the Information Society, which is an international framework that guides the work of the governments. And it has a specific declaration that all governments should basically implement programs to basically respond to the action lines of those declarations, which includes action lines that specifically focus on the need to use technology for women empowerment, which focuses specifically on the importance of equal digital literacy, on equal digital inclusion, which focuses on granting equal opportunities in ICT professions, which talks about women in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Not only this, the 2030 agenda also is a global agenda that is currently driving the work of all governments. And they willingly, all governments willingly adopted it, and their current development programs and current development policies and strategies and action plans are all steered towards implementing that. So governments play a major role. Governments' ownership is core, because no matter what the civil society does, no matter what the private sector does, if we do not have government ownership for the topic, then the efforts are going to stay haphazard, and we're not going to really reach the desired result. So this is
Thank you.
for me.
think that's a very good description from sort of your vantage of the role of government and international organizations, and a real plea for governments to be involved here and to always kind of keep one hand on the wheel, regardless of what's happening in other sort of sectors. Zaina, from your vantage and the kind of piece of the puzzle that you see most clearly and work on, what's the role of governments and international organizations in addressing the digital divide?
Sure, thank you, Melissa. And I would just like also want to add a color to what kind of Steve mentioned earlier on the partnership. I think it's very, very important to kind of have that understanding. You know, our partnership and our principle in Microsoft, as I said, is our mission statement is to empower every person in the organization. And with that notion, everything we do is in partnership. In fact, to Steve's point, one of the things we always say is we want to use technology and we want to use it as a tool when it makes sense and when it's the right tool. So as part of that, to give an example, actually, we partner with Facebook in enhancing the next generation of the TV white space. ASIC chip, which basically helps us. So we are very open and we partner different stakeholders. I think one of the things I would like to repeat and share is that our program, specifically the Urban Initiative program, it is not the philanthropic branch of Microsoft. It's a business, but also we make a public commitment. Whatever money we're making from this program is going to be reinvested back to helping bridging the digital divide. Now, going back to some of the things I think governments can do is actually providing a favorable policy and regulatory framework. I cannot emphasize how important this is. You know, for businesses to come and invest in the country or to expand their portfolio, they needed to see a clear and stable regulatory environment when it comes to telecommunication and infrastructure and also any sort of spectrum. What is also one other thing that we have seen as a very key important strategy is that having a national ICT policy and digital strategy. Countries like Kenya, for example, have developed a national strategy which helps to significantly bridge the digital divide, because it is clear when governments have clearly a stance on taking and adopting technology. Other important things to mention is, you know, we need to have laws and legislations, regulations by governments to enhance, again, bridging the digital divide. We need to create programs and initiatives such as like the Urban Initiative, which fosters public-private partnership to solve the digital divide. This is not a problem which can be solved by a single entity. It always needs to be a partnership. And most importantly, also, I think governments need to take initiative to adopt solutions. One of the challenges, in fact, that we saw was that there is no enough awareness and skills to use digital solutions. So governments, mostly in some countries, are the first stakeholders. They need to have local solutions where they can implement in agriculture, in healthcare, and other places, so that the public can take that advantage and also foster on that lead on the government. And most importantly, I think the policy arena is really critical of all the things. So I think all the points that I mentioned, on top of that, you know, upskilling and reskilling, even the government sector itself on the regulation, and learning from others who do it best and taking that and adopting that is really a key for bridging the digital divide.
Thank you. I think you hit on obviously a wide range of roles that the government could play, but then also this sort of plea that governments speak and learn from each other. So please do not reinvent the wheel. There's a lot of activity happening in this space, and it would behoove us to kind of look into that, engage, partner with other governments as well. Steve, why don't you finish us off here before we head into the Q&A? What's the role of governments?
Yeah, just really briefly, again, unsurprisingly, I agree with everything that Zaina and Sakine said. Maybe I'll just add one. Well, actually, I want to re-emphasize actually this point about the investment environment. I think it can't be said more strongly, particularly now as we kind of here, at least in the United States and obviously in Europe and other parts of the world as well, sort of remake our regulatory framework for many of these industries. The kinds of questions that we're talking about right now need to be part of that conversation. They won't be there unless people like us actually push them onto the agenda. So I think it's absolutely essential that as we do kind of modify the regulatory framework, we make sure that these considerations are on the table with regard to addressing all sorts of inequalities: gender, race, geography, economic. You mentioned it earlier, Melissa, urban, rural, economic status. It's got to be part of that conversation. The other point that I want to make is that, you know, something that we have worried about for some time, and to many people feels like it's now hitting a bit of a kind of an inflection point. What sometimes goes under the phrase balkanization or internet fragmentation or splinternet, whatever your favorite sort of acronym for that is. We've been working at CLTC on trying to develop some precise metrics of that phenomenon and looking at how bad it is, how fast it's moving, and so on and so forth. I think it's important for us as well, and it probably needs to be owned by some international organization to recognize that phenomenon, which is being driven by lots of different reasons, I don't think we want to get into that today, but mainly out of national capitals, will not actually, to the extent that it gets worse, that we have alternative technology regimes, alternative standard regimes, a Chinese internet, a Silk Road internet, a Silk Road internet, a US internet, Europe, like that's not going to make the problems that we've addressed today easier to solve. It's going to make them harder to solve because they will have to be solved in different realms at lesser scale, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So again, when we think about the issues that are really the core of what this panel wants to discuss today, internet fragmentation is another phenomenon that's going to make it harder. And I feel like we probably don't have the right international organization in the world right now to sort of address that. It doesn't really feel like a WTO issue. I can't really see the ITU or ICANN leaning directly into that. But boy, somebody's going to need to address that over the next couple of years. So if anyone wants to create a new international organization for exactly that purpose, get started.
We'll end the sort of moderated portion of the panel on that note. If anybody is listening and looking to create international organizations, there's some ideas floating around from Steve. Get in touch. All right, so we're going to shift to Q&A portion, and I have a large number of questions pouring in. So I will do my best to get through these, as many of these as possible. I do plead to the panelists to aid me in that endeavor and sort of try to keep your answers to each of these short so we can cover as much ground as possible. So the first question I have is for all of the panelists, and it's from Shelley Spencer, and she's a Strategic Impact Advisors with LLC. So her question is, what about the issue of affordability of devices to access digital networks and the cost of data plans? Who should step up on this issue? Donors, universal service funds? Who would like to sort of tackle that question first on the cost end of this question?
I'll take a quick swing at it, Melissa. I'm going to repeat the point I made earlier. I think that we want to see as much innovation in business models as we do in technology. And I think Zaina made the point in a compelling way. I think Sukane made it in another way with regard to the sort of lack of access for women to the technology. Ultimately, you can sell the device and give away the services. You can give away the device and sell it. There are lots and lots of different ways to price different parts of the value chain. And I would like to see the firms experiment with all of those things in order to increase, because we don't really have a tangible, a granular grasp of how people would like to monetize from there or pay for access. So let's create a whole bunch of different ways to do it. If you've recently bought an iPhone 12, as I have, you recognize that there's a very small number of possible ways to actually pay for that. And there's a lot of opacity in what the actual business model is. So let's create more ways and let's make it real transparent and do the best we can in that regard. That's a form of innovation that's as important as anything having to do with technology.
Sukane or Zaina, would you like to sort of weigh in on this question of affordability?
Sure, I would like to quickly add on this, and thank you, Shelley. This is really $1 million question. This is very, very important. And earlier, I tried to make my point, especially when it comes to affordability. I think with advancement of technology, we need to see all the different options. We need to think creatively how we can address this affordability challenge. One, both on the technology side, on the devices side, and also on the services side. When we ask people to pay a certain amount of money, the important thing to think is, are people willing to pay the amount of money, because does that justify the equipment cost and also the services cost? For this, we need really creative business models, and we need also government and private sector to step up and create funding opportunities to take some amount of the load from the public to drive that affordability.
Well, from my side, Melissa, I mean, already Stephen Seen already basically mentioned what I wanted to say. I just wanted to also add that the issue mentioned is of major concern in the Arab region, because one of the main challenges leading to the digital gender gap is affordability. Now, how to do so, already Stephen Zina said it, but I would like to reiterate on the need to provide different solutions, and at the same time, I draw 100 lines under partnership, because the government cannot do it on its own. The private sector should have incentive to do it. So the partnership between both parties can lead to affordable technologies and enhancing literacy to use those technologies. Thank you.
Thank you. The next question we have is for Zaina in particular. So Lauren Conray with MITRE asks you, in developing infrastructure as quickly as possible, sometimes I would imagine that occurs at the expense of sustainability. Do you anticipate any issues down the line with the quality of networks as usage dramatically increases in these communities? So Zaina, why don't you handle that question?
Sure. I actually would like kind of quickly reply on this question, because one of the things I did not mention earlier is that we have, as a company, released a lot of kind of statements recently, and also our commitment to sustainability. One of the important things is that there is no one way of building a network. It's a very capital intensive infrastructure building. It requires a lot of the different types of fields. But also as Microsoft, I think one of the things we're doing, we recently launched programs for sustainability, and I would actually encourage Lauren to read more, and I'm happy to share more on the sustainability side of things that we are doing. And we are a company, we are working towards to be a carbon negative, and most importantly, all our technologies are being created in such a way that we reduce waste and also have a sustainable environment, and in such a manner that it promotes sustainability.
Thank you. I think it's a great area and a kind of overlap of concerns between digital divides and broader sort of sustainability questions and interests as well. Absolutely. The next question I have is for the whole panel. It's from Dr. Heather Hudson. And Heather asks, in many regions, infrastructure costs aren't the main problem. Incentives for providers to serve these populations with reliable and affordable connectivity using whatever technology is most effective is the problem. So there are significant policy issues to address, both in rural, remote North America, but also in developing regions. Can each of you please comment on this set of concerns? So not the costs, but actually incentives to build out and invest in technology in these areas.
I can maybe quickly touch up on this and let Steve and to add on this. I think one of the things I would like to mention, in fact, this is specifically to US, there is a lot of funding opportunities that's coming out from the federal government. And part of the thing is, as an incentive for many telcos to reduce their costs, there are grant programs, funding programs, which includes the Connect Americans Fund. USDA also have different funds. And on top of that, there are universal funds. And one of the things actually in our team, what we do is, we have a digital transformation team. We also have a policy and regulatory team, which actually assists the telcos, because the telcos' primary business is to build networks. Their business is not to look into a regulator side or other things. So it helps actually the telcos who are building the network to give them kind of a summarized approach and show them, what are the policy implications whenever there's a change in policy, how that incentive is going to help you build the network. So we have a team in helping that, but also many regulators in the country on a national basis have incentives for people to build the network and for service providers to connect people.
Yeah, just to double down on that point, I think I think these are constructed markets in many respects. So the notion that, like, to draw a firm line between incentives and costs is, to my mind, a little bit peculiar. They're sort of the same thing. Policy makes these markets. And so the ways in which we construct the incentives actually become the question of cost. And I think one element that, I don't know if it's true in other parts of the world as well to the same extent, but here in the United States, we have to, at least my generation needs to get over this kind of collective bad reputation of telcos and cable companies. I think there's a dysfunctional and no longer useful resistance to the idea of incentivizing network build out, which in some cases means subsidizing companies like AT&T, Verizon, and Comcast, which nobody wants to like, to build network capacity. In fact, if we just get past that point and stop thinking of the telcos and the cable companies as somehow necessarily exploitative, and think of them more as baseline infrastructure providers, then we'd probably have a more reasoned and rational conversation about what kinds of incentives we want to provide and how we want to hold them to account for actually doing that network building on that basis. Again, I'd be curious what others see in other parts of the world with regard to that. But I think it's hurt us, not helped us, to be stuck in that past mindset.
Sakina, would you like to weigh in here?
Yes. I mean, I cannot agree more with what was said, but I just want to build on the point that Steve mentioned, which is dealing with the fact that it's baseline infrastructure providers. At the end of the day, they're the baseline infrastructure providers, and in our region, I mean, we have the same issues, and we would say, I mean, there should be this collaboration between the government and those baseline service providers. Both should have a win-win solution in that they both should have an added advantage in the issue. So that's the only thing I can add to the discussion. Basically, think of them as baseline providers that should have an incentive in providing the service, but at the same time, the governments should be interested in them and should basically give them the incentive to provide the service. So it's a mutual relationship.
A mutual relationship. It seems to be a theme throughout the day. Partnerships, mutual relationships, everybody has a role to play. So another question that I have for you, it's for the entire panel, is from Rob Crombie, and he's with Aerospace, and he introduces a different aspect of this conversation that we haven't touched on as much. So his question for you is, how do you see the evolving space-based solutions helping with last mile access? Do you think they will be affordable?
Well, I want to turn the question back to the questioner, because presumably he knows more about the technology trajectory certainly than I do in that regard. I don't know. I certainly hope so.
It's definitely a good question. We should bring him on next time. Zaina or Sakina, do you have some thoughts on this? The sort of last mile space-based assets, sort of backhaul perhaps through satellites?
I think I agree with Steve. This is actually, Rob probably can enlighten us more, but also I'd like to say a little bit about from the toolkit approach that I mentioned earlier. One of the things is using the right tool, and we clearly know satellite provide a significant role, especially from coverage point of view, but there are really some concerns on latency issues and also some concerns on cost. And we all know this businesses thrive and exist if only the business model works. That's why we need to have that partnership on a ground equipment or earth equipment. It's basically important how we drive that cost, either using satellite as a backhaul or also as an in-connectivity toolkit.
Perfect. It sounds like we will. Do you have something to add here, Sakina, on space-based assets?
Not really, except the fact that we also, I mean, the issue also varies from one region to another, and within a region, within one region, and within a country. So just wanted to highlight this.
Perfect. So I will defer that question back to the questioner, but also encourage them to take a look at some of the initiatives that STIP is doing around space policy in this area, and conversations we've been having, and we'll have pieces coming out in the future about sort of satellites as potential backhaul and companion to fiber backhaul around 5G networks and what that might look like for digital connectivity. So keep your eyes peeled on the STIP space if that's a question that you're particularly interested in. I have one more question that I'd like to try to get through for the entire panel. And this one comes from Salmiti Ramachik from the Center for International Digital Policy. Salamiti wants to know, what is the role of digital inclusion in addressing the digital divide? And what does it even mean to be digitally inclusive? So at sometimes we think about providing infrastructure and enabling access to the internet and think that would be enough to effectively and meaningfully use digital technologies and address socioeconomic inequalities. It probably isn't enough. So this question of digital inclusivity, What's the role that plays in the digital divide?
Probably I'll take the floor and start. When we talk about inclusion, we're talking about a concept that is being called for in the global development agendas. And when we're talking about inclusion, we're talking about by the word, it's inclusive to everyone, to all boys and girls, men and women, people with special needs, everyone with no exception. So when we're talking about digital inclusion, we're talking about the use, the access, and the skills. We're talking about agency to use and access and the capabilities to use of everyone. So how does it contribute to closing the digital divide? It goes without saying, if we opt for inclusion when we talk about digital access and literacy, we are bridging the divide. We are opting for bridging all divides, the digital divide, be it at the level of and all its aspects, from the gender divide, the income divide, the educational attainment, rural-urban divide, and many others. So achieving digital inclusion would mean we've basically bridged the digital.
So I'd like to take one more response here before we pivot to our closing, since we have 5 minutes remaining and it is in fact a Friday. And I am sure people have pressing social engagements from the social isolation of their home. So either Steve or Zaina, do you have some comments here that you would like to add? Let's sort of take one of you and then move to the final question.
I'll pass it to Steve if he has something to add.
Oh, I was going to do that to you, Zaina, but I'll do it anyway. So
Too polite.
Yeah, I mean, Melissa, it's a great question because in some sense it wraps right back to the kind of theme with which you opened this entire panel. That, you know, maybe 10 or 15 years ago, we would have thought of digital inclusion in a too narrow way, simply broadband access or internet access. And now we kind of like keep pushing the bar, as it were, up the stack. And I think that that's the only additional thought I have to argue on that, which is that the bar will probably keep going up. You know, I would like to raise it to the point of the language translation software. Others are going to want to raise it even higher. How far up the stack do we actually feel like we need to go? The only answer that I have to that question that I think should be consensual among everyone is that whatever answer we have, it's going to be inadequate.
We lost you for a second, but I think we ended on inadequate, which seems to be an accurate spot to end. So I'm going to pivot us, actually. Speaking of digital divides, we just experienced one right there with the good old Bay Area. So I'm going to end us on a rapid fire question across all 3 of our panelists. And I've asked them to prepare a wish list item. So we have, I believe, almost 600 or about 600 people that RSVP'd for this event that sit across industry, policy, scholarship, international organizations. So for each of you, thinking about the digital divides of the future, so not solving the divides of the past, but thinking about these pressing issues going forward. What is one thing that you think we need to understand, or one policy area we need to get started on now to be best equipped to handle those concerns of the future? So if you could snap your fingers, wave a magic wand, rub a genie, what's the one thing you would like people who are listening today to get started on today? And we'll go with Steve, Sukanya, and then Zaina.
Well, I had an answer to that question, Melissa, but I think I want to change it based on what I heard in this panel. The answer I had was, I want to see translation software and algorithms deployed with open source licenses, so that they can be broadly developed under a GPL kind of regime. But I think actually I'm now convinced that more basic to
Apologies, we seem to be experiencing a delay there with Steve. I'm going to jump to Sukanya.
Yes, sure, Melissa. Well, based on the discussion, on the very enriching discussion we had today, I would honestly, if I had the magic wand, I would make it mandatory for governments and all relevant stakeholders to embed gender transformative approaches in ICT-related programs, policies and strategies and action plans, and mainstream the transformative opportunities also offered by the digital technologies in gender policies. So that's what I would do.
Perfect. Excellent and brief. We will end with you, Zaina. You get the last word in our final minute of the panel.
Sure. Thank you, Melissa. I think I've mentioned it earlier, but also I will just, if I have the magic wand, I would say continue innovate on dynamic use of spectrum to foster efficient utilization and abundance of spectrum instead of scarce spectrum mentality. So we need to have innovative use of spectrum to change and bridge this digital divide.
Perfect. Thank you to everyone who has been involved. As you saw, we had some of our own digital divide connectivity issues, but I thank our audience for participating, all three of our panelists who brought expertise on a wide range of aspects of the digital divide, the Science, Technology, and Innovation Program, the Middle East Program, and also the Africa Program. If you're interested in any of these topics in more detail, please do engage with the initiatives coming out of those programs, as well as the work of our three panelists today. So thank you. I hope wherever you sit, whether it's government, international organizations, industry, scholarship, that you have learned something today and that you have your own wish list item that you will be chasing down in the future. Have a good rest of your afternoon.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.